Atlanta. A city that never fully sleeps even at 5 in the morning, the streets below are already moving. Delivery trucks, headlights cutting through the dark, the invisible machinery of a world that doesn't wait for anyone. And 32 floors up, a single light is on. A man stands at the window, still, looking down at all of it like he's done this 1,000 times, and today is different, and he hasn't decided yet how different. He turns, walks to the closet, past his 12 suits. Custom, the kind that announce a man before he speaks. His hand moves all of them, and stops on a gray coat. Old, simple. The kind of coat that remembers something the suits have forgotten. He puts it on, picks up a single piece of paper from the table. A boarding pass, seat 1A. And somewhere across the city, a woman in a Chanel skirt is already moving toward the same gate. She doesn't know his name yet. She's about to make the worst assumption of her life. Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, Gate C14, 6:47 a.m., Dallas-Fort Worth Airport Port. 6:47 in the morning, the kind of hour that doesn't belong to anyone in particular. Janitors pushing carts through empty corridors. Red-eye passengers still carrying yesterday on their faces. Business travelers who've done this so many times the airport exists for them, the way furniture exists, necessary, invisible, unremarkable. James Whitfield sat in a plastic chair at Gate C14 and looked like he belonged to none of those categories and all of them at once, 58 years old. Flannel shirt, blue, faded at both elbows in the specific way that happens from years of resting arms on desks and tables and car doors, not from any deliberate distressing. Canvas travel bag on the floor beside his feet, worn at the right bottom corner where it always hit the ground. Coffee from the vending machine near the restrooms, the kind that came out too hot and tasted like it had been waiting for someone to make a worse choice. He drank it anyway. Nobody looked at him twice. Not the gate agent sorting boarding passes. Not the young couple arguing quietly over which of them had packed the wrong charger. Not the businessman in the row across from him who was on his third phone call since James had sat down. That was the point. That had always been the point. His phone lay face up on his knee. One message, sent 6:31 a.m. from Delphine Hurst. Files complete. You need to read it before board meeting, James. Read it. He'd read the message 3 times. Not the file, the message itself. The way she'd written his name like that, not at the beginning of a sentence where it would make grammatical sense, but dropped in the middle like a weight, like a hand on a shoulder, like someone who had spent 17 years working alongside a person and had learned and exactly pawned that needed to be called by name instead of title. Delphine only wrote like that when something was worse than she'd expected, and Delphine expected a lot. He picked up the coffee, took a sip, looked out at the gate area. Gate C14 was filling the way airports fill in the early morning gradually, without ceremony. A young mother negotiating a collapsible stroller with one hand while keeping a grip on a toddler's wrist with the other, both of them losing the battle on separate fronts. 2 men in matching rolling luggage sets talking at each other with the particular rhythm of people who'd been having the same conversation for years and had stopped requiring responses. A teenager horizontal across 3 chairs, headphones on, completely unconscious, using the airport as a bed the way only the young and the unbothered can. Normal morning, normal gate, normal collection of people going somewhere. James watched all of them. He typed back, "I'll read it on the plane." The response came in 11 seconds, which told him she was already at her desk, which meant she'd been at her desk since before 6, which meant she hadn't slept, or had slept the 3 hours that Delphine called sleeping when she was in the middle of something. Don't wait too long. He set the phone down, reached into the outside pocket of his canvas bag, and pulled out a newspaper. The actual paper kind broadsheet, folded in quarters, with ink that still came off slightly on your fingers if the morning was humid. The kind of object that made younger people do a small double take, like they'd spotted something from a museum exhibit walking around in public. James liked that look. He'd been getting it for years. He intended to keep getting it. He opened to the front page and started reading. Gate C14 kept filling around him. The gate agent made an announcement about overhead bin space. The toddler started crying about something and then stopped. The businessman finished his 3rd call and immediately started a 4th. James read the paper and thought about his father. There was a specific reason he still bought newspapers from airport kiosks. And it had nothing to do with staying informed, and everything to do with a kitchen table in Southwest Atlanta and a man named Robert Whitfield, who had understood something about the world that most people never figured out. Robert Whitfield had been a mechanic for a decade and a bus driver for 31 years after that. He'd gotten to work at 6 every morning of his working life and left at 5 every evening, and he had never once complained about either of those facts. He'd raised his son in a house where the coffee was ready before 6 and the newspaper was on the table by 6:15. And every Sunday morning he would sit down with both and read the entire paper front to back every page, every section, the obituaries, the letters to the editor, the weather report. James had asked him once he was 9 years old, sitting across the table eating cereal, why he bothered reading the weather for cities like Portland and Milwaukee and Seattle when they lived in Georgia and had no plans to go anywhere. Robert looked up over the top of the page. He had the kind of face that didn't change expression quickly. Everything he felt moved through something first, got considered, and then arrived on his face as something measured and intentional. Because the world is bigger than what you can see from your own window, son, he said, and a man who only knows his own weather doesn't know much at all. James was 9 years old. He never forgot it. He was 12 the day the other thing happened. The thing that took him longer to understand, not because it was more complicated, but because understanding it required living long enough to see it from the right angle. Friday afternoon in September. The garage, smelling the way it always smelled at the end of a long week, oil and metal, and the particular exhaustion of work done right, repeatedly, without acknowledgement. A man pulled in driving a white Cadillac. Brand new, brilliant white in the September afternoon light. The kind of car that made a statement before the door opened. The man who got out was wearing a sport coat over an open-collar shirt and a watch that caught the sun when he moved his wrist, and the expression of someone who had died at some point that the world arranged itself around him, not the other way around. He had a leak in his coolant line. Robert diagnosed it in 5 minutes and fixed it in 40, the way he fixed everything thorough, precise, without shortcuts. When he was done, he wrote up the invoice and handed it over. The man looked at the invoice, then he looked at Robert, and said something, one word. James was standing in the doorway of the waiting room. He heard it. The word landed in the air of the garage like something solid, something with edges, and it just stayed there. It's the way certain things stay in certain spaces long after the person who put them there has gone. He watched his father's face. Nothing changed. That was the thing. That was the thing James spent the next 46 years turning over, examining from different angles, trying to fully comprehend. Not the word. The word he understood in the moment, viscerally, in his stomach before his brain had finished processing it. What he didn't understand, what took him years and then decades, was his father's face. Nothing changed in it. Not a muscle shifted. Not a breath altered. Robert Whitfield took the invoice back from the man's hand, wrote out a receipt, held out the car keys, and said, "Drive safe now, sir." The man took the keys and left. The white Cadillac backed out of the bay and pulled away down the street and disappeared around the corner. James walked out of the doorway and stood to his father. He didn't know what to say. So he asked the only question that was fully formed. "Why didn't you say anything?" Robert was quiet for a moment, wiping his hands on the shop rag the way he always did after a job, slow, methodical, each finger, both palms, not stalling. Thinking, "People see what they want to see, son," he said finally. You can't change their eyes by arguing with them. The only thing you can change is the world they're looking at. And you do that by how you live. Not by what you say. James was 12 years old. He built a Fortune 500 company on that sentence. Not immediately. Not easily. Not without the particular cost that comes from spending your life proving something to people who weren't paying attention in the first place. But the sentence was the foundation. The thing he came back to when the building got hard. When the work got difficult, when the room he was walking into had already decided what it thought about him before he opened the door. He didn't argue with rooms, he changed what they were looking at. The gate agent's voice came over the intercom. Flight 1184, Dallas to New York. Non-stop, departing 8:15. Now boarding priority passengers. James folded his newspaper. tucked it under his arm, picked up canvas bag on the right bottom corner, same corner it had always been worn at, and stood. He was the third person through the gate, not because he was in a hurry, because he wanted to be in his seat before she got on. Walter's memory, the flight that never landed there, is something Walter Hayes had never told an interviewer, not one. Not in 29 years of profiles and keynotes and commencement addresses where he talked about starting from nothing and building something that mattered. In all of those conversations, in all of those carefully constructed narratives about resilience and vision and the particular madness required to build a company to will and bad sleep and a belief in something that didn't exist. Yet he had never mentioned the flight in 1997. He was 37. Skybridge had been alive for 3 years, barely alive the way startups are barely alive, running on momentum and the refusal to admit when things were catastrophic. He'd saved for 6 months, rationing, deferring, making the kinds of small calculations that people with real money never have to make to buy a first-class ticket to Boston. A meeting with a venture capital firm that could change the trajectory of everything. He'd bought the ticket because he thought it would make him look serious, like he belonged in the room before he'd opened his mouth. He never made it to his seat. The flight attendant asked for his ticket twice, then called a supervisor, then positioned herself between Walter and row 1, with the practiced efficiency of someone executing a standard procedure, nothing overt, nothing she could be quoted on. Just the smooth institutional machinery of a decision that had been made before she'd finished looking at him. He'd been polite, measured, controlled the way his father had taught him to be controlled, not because the situation deserved his composure, but because some rooms were designed to make a man lose it, and losing it was exactly those rooms were waiting for. He'd missed the flight, missed the meeting. The firm funded a competitor 6 months later. He rebuilt anyway. Different, slower. On ground, he'd learned to read more carefully, but that flight attendant's face, the specific blankness of it, the way her eyes trace moved through him rather than landing on him, lived in a particular room in his memory. He visited it sometimes, never talked about it, and every time he boarded his own airline in the gray coat, every time he walked into a first-class cabin as a man nobody recognized, he was partly looking for that face, not to punish it, to understand whether his company had produced more of them. His father, Reverend Thomas Hayes, never owned a car, not because he couldn't eventually afford one, but because in Birmingham, in the years when Thomas Hayes was building his life, certain transactions simply did not complete. Certain conversations ended before they began. Nobody said why. They went quiet. They were suddenly out of stock, suddenly busy, suddenly looking at something just past his shoulder. Thomas Hayes rode the bus every single day of his working life with his back straight and his chin level, as if he were walking into a place he'd been specifically invited, not tolerated. Invited, Walter had asked him once, when Walter was 7 years old and had just come home from somewhere that had made him feel the wrong size. "Why do some people look at us like that, Daddy?" His father had been quiet for a moment. Then, "Because they haven't learned something yet, Walter. And that's a problem they'll carry long after we've put it down." Walter had carried that answer through 57 years. Through the flight of 1997. Through 29 years of building something he'd told himself was different. This morning, he was going to find out if it was. Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, 6:08 a.m. Hartsfield-Jackson at 6 in the morning was a different species of place than the one most people knew. No families navigating luggage the size of small vehicles. No children asking, "Are we there yet?" while standing 40 feet from the departure gate. Just travelers, efficient, self-contained, people for whom this had become a kind of commute. Bodies moving through the rhythms of it before consciousness had fully engaged. Walter moved through security without ceremony. Simple sneakers, easy to remove. No belt, phone in the bin before anyone asked. The TSA agent glanced up, standard scan, moved on. Walter collected his things and walked toward gate B12. He bought a copy of the Wall Street Journal at the newsstand. Paper, folded under his arm. Not because he was sentimental about the format, he read everything on his phone like everyone else. But a man reading a printed newspaper in an airport in the early morning registered differently than a man's scrolling a screen. People made different calculations. He was, as always, collecting data. Gate B12 was half full, with the particular population of an early Tuesday flight business travelers, mostly. A few who looked like they were returning from something rather than going toward it. The specific posture of people in transit between lives. Walter found a seat against the window, away from the charging stations where people clustered and talked too loudly and half listened to each other while fully attending to their screens. He ordered coffee from the gate kiosk, opened the journal to page 3, did not read it, watched. A man in his 40s working a phone call with the focused aggression of someone whose deal had gone sideways overnight. A woman 2 seats over, holding toward the light, scrolling through photographs, pausing on one, smiling the private smile of someone looking at something they love. A young man across the gate asleep under a jacket, one earbud in, one out, trusting that someone nearby would notice when the boarding announcement came. Ordinary people going ordinary places. Every one of them deserving a flight where nobody made them feel like they'd wandered into a room that wasn't theirs. Walter pulled the boarding pass from his pocket, looked at it, seat 1A. His name in clean ink smudged at one corner. The Skybridge logo in the upper left, the airline he had founded in a shared office in 1994 with 2 employees, one of whom was also his accountant, with a business plan he'd revised 47 times before he stopped revising it and just started doing it. He'd folded the boarding pass back, returned it to his front pocket, the same place, the same fold. Somewhere he could reach it in one clean motion. He'd done this 17 times. He knew the shape of what was coming. He did not yet know how much worse this one would be. First-class cabin, flight 609, 6:19 a.m. The boarding announcement came at 6:14. Walter let 3 groups go before he stopped. He was not in a hurry. He was also, if he was honest with himself, postponing the moment when the test became real. There was always a beat before these things began when he could still be just a man with a ticket. After the first moment of contact, he was something else, a subject in an experiment he was running on his own and his airline, collecting evidence he both needed and was afraid of. He boarded with the final premium group. The jet bridge was cool and slightly dim, the particular non-space between gate and aircraft that belonged to neither fully. He walked through it and turned left at the cabin door. The first-class cabin of a Skybridge 737 held 12 seats, 4 rows of 3, the left side a single seat, the right side a pair, with enough width that the armrest didn't feel like negotiated territory. Clean, well-maintained, the kind of space that signaled care without ostentation. Walter found 1A, window, left side. He settled in, stored his briefcase in the overhead plain leather, initialed in small letters that no one would notice, unless they were specifically looking, and pulled the journal from under his arm. Set his coffee on the tray table. The boarding pass kept in his pocket. 2 other passengers were already seated. A woman in 2B adjusting her reading light. A man in 3C with eyes closed and headphones on, already somewhere else entirely. The galley at the front of the cabin was quiet. Morning crew still running through their checklists. Walter opened the newspaper. Read approximately 4 sentences. Then stopped reading and looked out the window at the tarmac, where the first light of morning was arriving in the way Atlanta light arrived in March, slowly at first, then suddenly the sky going from gray to something that could almost be called gold. He thought about Sandra's file, 3 complaints, 18 months, all closed. He thought about the 17 flights before this one, and what he's observed on each of the moments, too small for formal complaint, but too consistent to be accidental. The way a certain kind of passenger got a certain kind of attention. The way assumptions moved through a cabin like weather, shaping what was offered and to whom. He thought about Elliot Marshrecht, Regional Operations Director. 9 years with the company, reliable metrics, efficient operation. Not a man who'd ever given Walter reason to look harder, which was, perhaps, exactly the problem. Walter was still looking out the window when Margaret Holloway boarded the aircraft. He heard her before he saw her, the specific rhythm of someone who moved spaces, expecting them to arrange themselves accordingly. Heels on the jet bridge floor, the small, efficient sounds of a carry-on being managed with practiced ease. She appeared in the cabin doorway. He didn't look up directly. He'd learned over 17 flights to observe without appearing to observe. It was a skill his father had, 2, the ability to read a room completely while appearing to attend only to your own concerns. He watched her in his peripheral vision. She was in her late 50s, Chanel's skirt precisely pressed. Takai earrings catching the cabin light even at this hour. A carry-on in Bottega leather. Todd's shoes that had been polished recently. The whole presentation assembled with the care of someone who understood that appearance was a form of argument, a way of winning rooms before the conversation started. She stood in the aisle and looked at the seat numbers. Hers moved to 1A. She looked at Walter in his gray coat and his jeans, his simple sneakers, looking at a newspaper he wasn't reading. He saw the calculation happen. Saw it in the half-second shift of her attention, the way her body settled into a decision before she'd consciously made one. 3 seconds. That's all it took. Excuse me. Her voice was smooth and accustomed to compliance. I think you're in my seat. Walter looked up. Her face held the polite certainty of someone delivering an obvious correction. He met her eyes and held them for a moment. Seat 1A, he said. He reached into his front pocket and withdrew the boarding pass in a single motion, extended it toward her. That's what my ticket says. She did not look at the paper in his hand. Not a glance. Not even the beginning of a glance. Her eyes stayed on his face, on his coat, on whatever it was she'd already decided. There must be a misunderstanding, she said. I always fly 1A. The gate agent would be happy to help sort that out, Walter said. He lowered the boarding pass, returned to the newspaper. The woman he didn't know her name yet stood in the aisle for a moment, then pressed the call button above seat 1A, and the morning began in earnest. Frank Dobbs had been chief purser with Skybridge Airways for 14 years. He was a large-framed man of a 54, with a voice trained for precision in noisy environments and a self-possession that came from a decade and a half of managing the particular human theater that plays out 30,000 feet in the air. He took professional pride in his read of a boarding situation. 14 years meant pattern recognition. 14 years meant you could walk into a problem and understand it before anyone had finished explaining. He came forward from the front galley at the call, took in the cabin, woman in the aisle, Chanel skirt, diamond earrings. The precise presentation of someone who flew this class regularly and expected to be recognized as such. Man in 1A, gray coat, jeans, walking shoes, a printed newspaper, coffee from a gate kiosk, not the lounge. 3 seconds, Frank oriented the woman first. Naturally, without deliberation, without recognizing it as a choice, ma'am. Is there a problem? This gentleman seems to have the wrong seat. Frank turned to the man in 1A. Sir, economy class is toward the rear of the aircraft. The man looked up from his newspaper, with eyes that were steady in a way Frank couldn't quite categorize. Not reactive, not defensive, something more like patient. Like he was waiting for the moment when the room caught up to a thing he already knew. He held out the boarding pass. The same one he'd shown the woman. Still extended. I'd appreciate it if you'd look at this before reaching a conclusion, he said. His voice was quiet, flat, affect. The voice of someone who had long since stopped expecting this to go easily and had learned to navigate it anyway. Frank did not look at the boarding pass. This was the moment, the hinge. Small enough to miss if you weren't watching for it. Frank Dobbs. 14 years of pattern recognition, a boarding pass extended in a passenger's hand, and not one flicker of his attention moving toward it, because he'd already decided. And the decision wasn't about the evidence. Sir, if you'd please make your way. My name is Walter Hayes, the man said. Still quiet. And I would like you to look at my documentation before making a determination about where I belong. Frank positioned himself between Walter and the front of the cabin. Standard management's practiced motion. Behind him, in the rear galley, Flight attendant Carol Brennan stood perfectly still with one hand on the beverage cart and her eyes on the zap between the curtain and the wall. She had seen the boarding pass when Walter first sat down. She'd been stocking the overhead storage 2 feet away, close enough to read the seat number without trying. 1A. Clear as anything. She knew he was right. She also knew what had happened in 2021 when she'd contradicted Frank Dobbs in front of a passenger. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't filed a complaint. He'd just rearranged things, scheduling, routes, rotation assignments until 6 months of her professional life had been quietly made as difficult as possible. Nothing you could point to, nothing you could appeal. Just the steady application of institutional pressure by someone who had the authority to apply it. 6 years until pension. She let the curtain fall. Told herself someone else would notice. Kevin Merritt arrived because Frank gestured for backup. 27 years old. Second year. He looked at Frank, looked at the woman, looked at Walter, and performed the calculation that the room's arrangement suggested. He stood behind Frank, because that's what you did when you were 27 and wanted to be seen as someone who handled situations well. You aligned with authority. You didn't introduce doubt into a situation that seemed, from where he was standing, to be already understood by the people who'd been doing this longer than he had. The thought surfaced once. What if he's right? Kevin pushed it down. He stood behind Frank. Margaret Holloway, settled now into the warmth of 1A, was speaking. Her voice had found the tone she used in boardrooms, smooth, certain, faintly sympathetic in a way that didn't actually invite sympathy for anyone but herself. She said something about presentation standards, about knowing where you belonged, about the premiumous experience and who it was designed for. She gestured, briefly, toward Walter's coat. Walter looked down at the coat, then looked back at her with an expression that Margaret found, in some part of herself she didn't want to examine, more unsettling than anger would have been. Not wounded, not indignant, curious. The way a scientist is curious about a phenomenon they've encountered before and are still finding instructive, ma'am, Walter said. Would you like to see my boarding pass? He extended it again. She didn't take it. At that moment, Eleanor Voss, 67 years old, silver hair cut close, navy jacket, with a small silver pin at the lapel, gently closed the document on her laptop in seat 1B. She had been present for this entire exchange, had seen Frank Dobbs not look at the boarding pass, had seen Kevin Merritt arrange himself behind the wrong person, had watched Margaret Holloway gesture toward the gray coat as if it constituted evidence. Eleanor Voss had spent 22 years on the federal bench. She knew what evidence looked like. She knew what its absence looked like. Her hand moved to the pin at her lapel, small, discreet. It looked like decorative silver. Frank had glanced at it once and dismissed it. She touched it once. A deliberate press settled back, waited. Frank Dobbs called for airport security at 6:58 a.m. Through the cockpit door, Captain Eduardo Rodriguez, 28 years with Skybridge, the last 6, as captain on the Atlanta-New York corridor, heard the radio call and stayed where he was. Protocol said crew handled passenger situations. He stayed. He would come to regret that in approximately 40 minutes. Walter Hayes. Hearing Frank's security call, set down his newspaper, looked out the window at the tarmac where the March morning was now fully light. The gold burned off, the sky the flat blue of a day that had committed to being cold. He looked at his hands, then he reached into his other pocket. Not for the boarding pass. For his phone, I think, he said quietly. Linked to no one in particular, or perhaps to the window, or perhaps to Eleanor Hayes. Somewhere in the particular space the people we've lost continue to occupy. It's time. The phone unlocked. 3 layers of security, each deliberate. Then an application opened built for a specific purpose, used by a specific number of people, which was the smallest possible number, because there was only one person whose employment record bore the identifier it was about to display. The Skybridge Airways executive interface. It loaded, the header appeared, and everything that had been moving toward this moment since a man in a gray coat sat down in seat 1A began finally to arrive. Officer James Okafor had been working airport security for 16 years. He'd seen things that didn't fit any training manual. A man who tried to board a flight to Denver with a live chicken in a canvas tote bag, calm as if this were standard. A woman in business class who'd invoked diplomatic immunity over a reclined dispute, producing documentation that turned out to be a laminated restaurant loyalty card. He'd seen grief and rage and the specific dissociation of people whose lives had just changed in the terminal, and who were moving through security on instinct alone. He thought he had seen the full range. He walked down the jet bridge at a measured pace. Measured, not slow, there was a difference. Slow suggested uncertainty. Measured suggested you were the kind of person who assessed before acting. James Okafor was exactly that kind of person. His partner, Officer Diana Webb, 34 years old and 3 years into the job, came in a step behind him. She had her notepad open before she reached the cabin door. She had learned, working with Okafor, that the record of a situation began the moment you entered it. James stepped into the cabin. He read it the way he always read a new space, the whole before any part. 200 passengers in various states of attention, most of them bidden not to watch what was happening in first class while watching it completely. 4 crew members clustered near the front. A woman in a Chanel skirt in seat 1A with the posture of someone who had decided they were right and was waiting for the institution to confirm it. A man in a gray coat standing in the aisle boarding pass in hand, still extended, as if he'd been holding it there long enough that it had simply become part of his posture. James looked at the boarding pass first, before anything else. Before Frank Dobbs could begin his explanation. Before the woman could establish her version. Before the room's arrangement could start making arguments on anyone's behalf, he crossed to Walter and took the paper. Write it. Seat 1A. Walter D. Hayes. The print clean and sharp where it mattered. Slightly smudged at one corner from folding. He read it again, looked up at Walter, looked at seat 1A. His jaw tightened, very slightly. The motion of a professional who has understood a situation completely and is deciding how to handle that understanding, ma'am. He turned to the woman in 1A. Could I see your boarding pass as well, Lizopa? Margaret Holloway opened her phone without hesitation. The confidence of someone who had not yet understood that the ground was moving. She held the screen toward him. James looked at both documents. The cabin was very quiet. Ma'am, he said, his voice carrying the care of someone setting something fragile down. Your boarding pass shows seat 3A. Margaret blinked, a small blink, the kind that happens when a word lands before the brain has processed it. That's not, she started. I always fly 1A. My daughter made the reservation. She knows I always. Seat 3A, James said. Confirmed on the booking. Margaret called her daughter. The call took 23 seconds. Priya's voice came through warm and rushed, and immediately, genuinely apologetic. Mama, I'm so sorry. I was booking late. I didn't check the seat number. I just grabbed F first available in first class 23 seconds. That was all it took to dismantle the architecture of a morning. Margaret lowered the phone. She stood in the aisle of a first-class cabin and understood, for the first time since she'd stepped onto this aircraft, what she had actually done, not the seat, the man. The way she'd looked at him in that coat, and those jeans, and those simple shoes, and made a decision in less time than it takes to read a sentence. The words she'd used afterward. All of it built on nothing. No information, no question asked. No paper examined, just a glance and a verdict. She looked at Walter Hayes, who was watching her with the same tension he'd maintained throughout. Not triumphant, not performing patience, just present. The way people are present when they've been through a version of something before and have learned adequate for the moment, when the room catches up to what they've known from the beginning. Frank Dobbs looked at James Okafor's face and understood that the calculation he'd made at boarding had been catastrophically wrong. He opened his mouth, closed it. The clipboard hit the floor and stayed there. Kevin Merritt took one step backward, then stopped. Because there was nowhere to go and he knew it, Margaret Holloway had gone the specific color of someone for whom a bad morning has just revealed itself to be an entirely different order of disaster, Eleanor Voss. In 1B had not moved. She looked like someone watching a verdict beck come in that she'd anticipated and took no particular pleasure in. Deanna Webb. Standing near the cabin door, was writing steadily. She had been writing since she entered. She would not stop until the aircraft pushed back. Walter put the boarding pass back in his front pocket and reached for his phone. He navigated through 3 layers of security and opened the application that existed on no public server, built for a specific purpose, used by the smallest possible number of people. He turned the screen toward James Okafor. James read it. Skybridge Airways Executive Interface. Walter D. Hayes, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Equity Position, 61. 3%. Employee Authority level, unrestricted. He read it once, then read it again with the deliberateness of a person's making sure they have understood what they have read before responding to it. Then looked up at Walter. Sir, he said, one word. Complete transform from the last time he'd used it. Same letters. Entirely different weight. Walter said nothing. James stepped back, a single, quiet step of recalibration. He turned the phone toward Frank Dobbs. Frank looked at the screen. What happened to Frank Dobbs's face in the next 4 seconds happened in distinct stages. Confusion first. The screen not parsing, then recognition. The name landing somewhere below, conscious thought, then horror, The quiet kind, the kind that arrives when a person understands with total completeness exactly what they have done, send something beneath the horror that was worse, the understanding that he had known. Not consciously, not in any form he could have articulated. But somewhere in the machinery of judgment that had run through this entire morning, some signal had been available that he had not attended to. The clipboard was already on the floor. He didn't reach for it. Kevin Merritt had seen the screen from 2 feet away. He was standing very still. His mouth was slightly open. He looked like someone who had just realized that the person he'd been standing behind had walked them both off a cliff. Margaret Holloway, still in the aisle, had gone the specific color of someone for whom a bad morning has just become something else entirely. Eleanor Voss. In 1B had not moved, had not changed expression. She looked like someone watching arrive that she had anticipated and took no pleasure in. Frank Dobbs found his voice and did the thing that cornered people do when they're too far in to find the exit gracefully. He pushed forward. First-class cabin. The counterattack, Mr. Hayes, he said the name correctly this time, which was somehow worse than anything that had come before it, the sudden fluency with a name he'd dismissing for the last 40 minutes. Before this goes any further, Frank's voice had shed its authority, but picked up something else, in its place harder, more compressed, the voice of someone calculating odds in real time. There have been complaints filed through our system, 3 of them, 18 months, all 3 reviewed by the regional office, all 3 closed before investigation. The cabin was completely silent. You run this company, Mr. Hayes. You have access to every system. So I want to ask, he paused. And the pause was a weapon, deliberately deployed. Did you know about those complaints, or is today the first you're hearing? Nobody moved. James Okafor's pen stopped above his notepad. Deanna Webb, still near the cabin door, went very still. Margaret Holloway, who had been in the process of locating the appropriate expression for her situation, forgot what she was looking for. Because Frank Dobbs had just thrown something into the center of the room, and everyone was waiting to see what Walter Hayes did with it. Walter was still, not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of a man who has been handed a grenade and is deciding, with great care, where to set it down. He held Frank's gaze. You're right, he said. Frank had not expected that. No one had. 3 complaints, Walter said. 18 months. All closed before investigation. I didn't know about them yesterday. He paused. The pause was not a weapon. It was something else, a space he was making for a truth that was going to be uncomfortable. That is my failure, and I will own it. He let that sit. Then, it doesn't change what happened in this cabin this morning, Mr. Dobbs. But it means we're not talking about a single incident. We're talking about something with a longer history than this flight. Frank had thrown the grenade, expecting it to detonate on impact. Walter had picked it up, examined it, and placed it on the table between them with the pin still in. Which was not the outcome Frank had calculated for. Which was, it turned out, not a situation Frank had any script for. Because here was what Frank had not understood when he'd made his move. Walter Hayes had not spent 45 minutes standing in an aircraft aisle simply absorbing the experience. He'd been thinking, working, running the same kind of analysis he'd run in every difficult meeting, every crisis negotiation, every moment over 29 years when the situation required him to understand not just what was happening, but why it had been allowed to happen and who had benefited from it continuing. 3 complaints. 18 months, all closed. Closed by whom? That was the question. Frank's challenge had surfaced, and it was the question Walter was going to answer. His phone was already ringing. Before Frank finished speaking, Sandra had been Walter's chief of staff for 8 years. She had a specific voice she used when information was more complicated than its headline, a voice that was precise without being alarming, that delivered difficult things at a speed designed to allow comprehension rather than reaction. She used that voice now. The 3 complaints came through the standard system, she said. Filed correctly. Reviewed by the Southeast Regional Office. Reclassified as insufficient evidence and closed within 30 days of each filing. No investigation initiated. No upward notification sent. Who authorized the classification? Regional Operations Director, Southeast. He used a subsection of the complaint review protocol that gives regional directors discretion to close cases they deem insufficiently documented. The protocol exists for legitimate purposes. He used it for these three. Walter processed this. How long has Marsh been with the company? 9 years, clean record. Solid operational metrics, no prior flags. Is there a pattern beyond these three? A pause. I've been looking at that for 3 weeks, Sandra said. The formal complaint record is what it is 3 cases, 18 months. But if you look at the informal feedback system, the post-flight satisfaction surveys, the voluntary comment submissions, there's a pattern that goes back further. Passengers on Southeast routes, first-class cabins, reporting feeling unwelcome without being able to cite a specific incident. The language is diffuse, nothing actionable in isolation. But the geographic and demographic clustering is, she stopped. It's not random, Walter. Walter looked out the window, the tarmac, the flat blue sky, Atlanta doing what it always did, indifferent to the particular human theater playing out in the aircraft parked at Gate B12. How long? He said. The pattern in the informal system goes back approximately 4 years. 4 years, not 3 complaints, not 18 months. 4 years of something being carefully maintained at a level just below the threshold where it would require formal attention from anyone with the authority to act. Elliot Marsh had not created this culture. Walter understood that cultures were not created by single people. They grew in conditions in the gaps between policies and practice, in the spaces where institutional pressure and individual discretion met without adequate oversight, in the silence of people who knew something was wrong and calculated that speaking was more expensive than staying quiet. Frank Dobbs hadn't created it either. He'd participated in it, maintained it, made it a little stronger every positioned himself that he swinged a passenger and their evidence without looking at the evidence. And Walter had built the conditions in which it was possible. That was the thing he couldn't move past. He'd built 17 floors of reporting infrastructure and trusted it to catch what it needed to catch. He'd reviewed compliance reports that came back clean and believed them. He'd assumed that the architecture of accountability he'd constructed was functioning the way architecture functions when it's working invisibly, reliably in the background. He hadn't looked at what was growing in the gaps. Sandra, he said, and his voice was quiet in the way that his voice went quiet when he'd finished processing something and moved into the register of decision. I need Elliot Marsh's system access suspended immediately. Full HR investigation, today. He is not to be contacted before that meeting. Done, she said. His access expired 40 seconds ago. Walter looked at Frank Dobbs. You raised something true, he said. I want you to understand that I'm taking it seriously, and that it will be fully investigated, and that whatever accountability follows will be real. He paused. And I want you to understand that none of that changes the fact that you looked at me this morning and made a decision before you looked at a single piece of evidence. Those are two separate failures, but both of them will be addressed. Frank stood there with the specific paralysis of a man who has run out of moves. Kevin Merritt was looking at his shoes. Rear galley. First-class cabin. Carol Brennan pushed the curtain aside. She didn't announce it, didn't clear her throat or wait for a pause or calculate the optimal moment. She simply moved the motion of someone who has made a decision after the time for making it had technically passed, and who has decided to make it anyway. She walked from the rear galley to the front of the cabin and stood where everyone could see her. 59 years old, 29 years with this airline. The posture of someone who had spent 3 decades in narrow aisles, learning to take up exactly the right amount of space, and was now for the first time choosing to take up more. Mr. Hayes. Her voice shook on the first syllable, found its footing on the second. I saw your boarding pass when you first sat down. I was stocking the overhead storage directly above your seat. I read the seat number clearly. I knew you were in 1A, and I knew you were right. The cabin that had been very quiet went quieter. Walter turned to look at her. I didn't say anything. She held his gaze. Her hands were clasped in front of her, not performing composure, just needing something to hold on to. I knew why I wasn't saying it. The reasons I had were real. They were also not good enough. And I stood behind that curtain anyway while you stood in this aisle. Walter looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at people all morning, without the overlaid narrative, without the conclusion already drawn, just actually looking. Seeing what was there, thank you, Miss Brennan, he said. 2 words, not absolution, not performance. Just the genuine acknowledgement of someone who understood that what she'd done had been costly, and that she'd done it anyway, and that those two things together meant something. Carol Brown, 59 years old, 29 years, 6 more. The pension she'd been building since she was 30 stood in the front of the first-class cab, while her face did what faces do when something's held for a very long time finds a point of release. She made no sound, just stood there. Kevin Merritt, watching her, felt something shift in his chest that he wouldn't be able to name for several days. Later, talking to his mother on the phone, he would describe it as the moment he understood the difference between reading the room and reading the situation. He'd been doing the first one all morning. Carol Brennan had just demonstrated the second. Margaret Holloway was watching Carol, too. She was watching with the expression of someone who was performing an unwanted accounting, tallying things, one by one, that she would rather not be adding up. The woman standing at the front of the cabin had known the truth, had stayed silent because the cost of speaking was real and specific and had already been paid once before. And then walked out anyway. Margaret thought about what it would have taken to do that, compared it involuntarily to what it had taken to step into the aisle this morning and tell a man to move. The comparison was not flattering. Walter opened his contacts. He made 3 calls. On speaker, with the phone held where the cabin could hear, because he had decided sometime in the last 30 minutes that transparency was not a strategy today. It was the point. You didn't repair a culture that had been maintained in the dark by moving it into a different kind of dark. You brought it into the open and you showed people what repair looked like when it was real. The first call, Patricia Hendricks, legal. Her voice was sharp, focused, a person for whom the shift from off to on was instantaneous. Patricia, I'm on flight 609 out of Atlanta. I've been discriminated against by 4 members of our own crew and a passenger. Multiple passengers have been recording the incident since approximately boarding time. I need federal documentation prepared under Title II of the Civil Rights Act, both individual and institutional liability. A beat that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, sir. Are you physically safe? Yes, but we have a systemic problem that goes deeper than this fight, and I want federal oversight of the full investigation. Contact DOT and the FAA. Don't wait for further instruction from me. Move now, moving now. Do you want us to notify the board? I'll handle the board. He ended the call. The second call, Vanessa Cole, HR. Vanessa's voice was measured, the voice of someone who had been in this job long enough to have heard difficult calls and knew how to receive them. Vanessa, I need employment actions for Flight 6609 crewbers, effective immediately. Record everything. Margaret Holloway, who had moved to stand seat 3A, was very still. Her carry-on was still in the overhead above 1A. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't asked for anything since the call to Priya. She was standing, processing. Frank Dobbs, Walter said. He did not look at Frank while he said it, which was somehow worse than if he had. Immediate termination with cause. No severance, no continuation of benefits. Permanent notation in the industry database preventing rehire in commercial aviation. His employment ends today. Frank made a sound, not a word. The sound a person makes when something they've built their professional identity around for 14 years becomes past tense, in a single sentence. Kevin Merritt. Walter looked at Kevin now. Kevin met his gaze and held it with the specific courage of someone who had stopped calculating and was simply receiving whatever came. 1-year probationary period. Mandatory bias training, monthly certification, bi-weekly individual counseling sessions. Not punitive developmental. He followed someone he trusted and compounded a situation he didn't create. That distinction matters. But it doesn't make what he did acceptable, and it doesn't mean the next 12 months will be easy. Kevin nodded. One small, precise nod caught Carol Brennan. The name landed differently in his voice, not softer, but differently weighted. No disciplinary action of any kind. Full employment protection. A formal commendation for demonstrating moral courage under professional pressure entered into her personnel file today and reflected in her next review. He looked at Carol. What Ms. Brennan did this morning cost her something real. I want the record to say she did it. Anyway, Carol pressed her lips together, nodded once. The kind of nod, doing the work of several other things at once. Regarding Elliot Marsh, Regional Operations Director Sandra has already suspended his system access. I'll call you separately with the full investigative scope. For now, we'll prepare the paperwork for a formal HR investigation with potential termination for cause. He is not to be informed of the investigation's specifics before the meeting. Understood, Vanessa said. Anything else? Start building the file for a comprehensive audit of the Southeast Regional Complaint Management System. Every case Marsh touched in the last 4 years reviewed by an independent team with no connection to his office. I'll have a team assembled by end of business. He ended the call. Across the cabin, the woman in 12B had been quietly crying since Walter began speaking to the crew. She had a tissue but wasn't using it, just holding it. The man in 7C had closed his laptop at some point during the first call and had not reopened it. The older couple in 15A and 15B had been holding hands since Carol Brennan walked out of the galley, and neither of them had said anything to the other because 41 years of marriage had made certain forms of communication redundant. The third call was shorter, Sandra again. Lower voice, slightly angled from the cabin, though not fully private. The formal complaints are 3, Walter said. The actual pattern goes back 4 years. I want the full scope of the investigation to reflect like that. External civil rights auditors, not internal review. Organizations with standing, independent. Third party, already reaching out, Sandra said. One more thing. Your son called the main office line about 40 minutes ago. I told him you were unavailable but safe. He's called twice more since. Walter was quiet. Tell him I'll call him when we have a moment, he said. He put the phone in his pocket, stood in the aisle of his own aircraft, and turned finally to Margaret Holloway. He sat across the aisle from her, eye to eye, not standing over her, not performing authority. Present, they talked. The conversation took 12 minutes. The cabin heard most of it. Margaret chose option 2, the harder one, the one that required her to stand in front of rooms of people and explain not just what she'd done, but how it had felt like not doing anything. How the judgment had arrived with the texture of clarity rather than decision. She said it clearly, without looking away. Walter stood when it was finished. He retrieved his laptop from the overhead above 1A, where he'd stored it with his briefcase at boarding. He took to the jump seat near the galley, not 1A, not yet, because what Cake's net required focus, and the jump seat was where he needed to be to write without up the way the seat's symbolism pressing on every word. He began typing the dignity protocol. He typed without stopping. Body cameras for all customer-facing crew, mandatory in any interaction involving a seating dispute, a complaint, or a request for documentation. Footage reviewed weekly by a team with no operational connection to the regional office that generated it. Every discrimination complaint escalated automatically to an independent review board within 24 hours of filing, not flagged for possible follow-up, automatically escalated by system design to people with no stake in its outcome, a passenger advocate at every major hub. Independent, reporting directly to the CEO's office, no intermediate layer, anonymous reporting by 3-digit text code on every seatback card. Guaranteed written response in 24 hours, $28 million over 3 years. A specific figure calculated from headcount, training hours, audit costs, review board infrastructure, and independent auditing requirements. Not a round number, not a press release number. The actual number the math produced, annual third-party civil rights audit, published in full. Every finding, every metric, whether or not they were favorable. He finished the document and Sandra Boulder. Distribute to legal and HR for immediate implementation review. 90-day rollout timeline. Interim measures within 2 weeks. Then he opened the company-wide email. He wrote it himself, every word. He considered routing it through communications for approximately 30 seconds, then closed that consideration. The email had to be his words, or it was nothing corporate language would transform a morning like this one into a learning opportunity, and he would not let that happen. He wrote until the email was honest. Then he stopped writing and read it once and then sent it. The timestamp bump on the sent confirmation read 7:18 a.m. He looked up. The gate was still visible through the window. They hadn't moved yet. Good. He set the laptop aside, picked up his phone and called his son. Danny Hayes answered on the first ring. He was 31 years old and he was in the library of his law school in Washington, and he had been there since approximately 40 minutes after his mother's birthday reminder had led him to check in with his father's office, and Sandra had said he's on a flight. He's fine. I can't say more right now in a voice that communicated considerably more than those words. He'd found the live stream 17 minutes later. 3 of them, running simultaneously on different platforms, capturing the same cabin from different angles. He'd watched all 3 on a split screen with his constitutional law textbook open in front of him and untouched for 47 minutes. Dad, his voice had the controlled quality of someone who had been practicing steadiness for 47 minutes and was doing a reasonable job of it. Are you okay? I'm okay, Walter said. I watched the whole thing, I know. A pause. Sandra told me about the 3 complaints, Danny said. And Marsh, his voice was the voice he'd been developing in law school, precise. The voice of someone learning to separate the personal from the professional, even when the personal was his father, standing in an aisle for 38 minutes. I have the preliminary structure for a federal complaint ready. I can file in 2 hours if you want. Or we let Patricia's team handle it. Or both. But I needed you to know it exists. Put it on hold, Walter said. Patricia's team is moving. Eleanor Voss has a recording going to federal regulators independently. Let the process work. Okay, a beat. Dad, yes. When she walked out of the galley, Danny's voice changed registers. The law school cadence dropped. Something younger came through. Something that had been watching his father's face on 3 live streams for 47 minutes. Carol Brennan. I watched her walk out. I watched your face when you said thank you. Walter said nothing. I know what today is, Danny said. I know it's Mom's Day. Walter looked out the window at the flat blue sky. The tarmac doing its patient work. Yes, he said. She would have had a lot to say about this morning, Danny said. She always had a lot to say. A small sound from Danny's end that was partly a laugh and partly something else. She would have been proud of you, Danny said. She also would have pointed out that you've been doing these checks for 2 years and not finding what you needed to find, and that maybe the checks themselves needed a check, and she had a specific suggestion about how to redesign the oversight architecture. Delivered at dinner. While also criticizing your coffee, Walter closed his eyes, opened them. That's exactly right, he said. I love you, Dad. I love you, Danny. He ended the call, sat for a moment with the phone in his lap. Then he stood, picked up the laptop, and moved from the jump seat to 1A, not because the seat was waiting for him, not to make a point. Because what came after the email, the things that would need to be handled on the ground in New York. The board call, the follow-up with Patricia's team, required the tray table that folded flat, and the jump seat surface was too narrow for what the next 2 hours demanded. He sat down, put the laptop away. The gray coat was in the overhead above him, outside, Atlanta, March. The sky that had gone from gray to gold to flat blue over the course of a morning that had become something else entirely. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the cabin speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. I want to personally apologize for our delay this morning. We'll be pushing back shortly. Flight time to New York is 2 hours and 12 minutes. On behalf of the entire Skybridge crew, thank you for your patience. He paused, Mr. Hayes. It's an honor to have you aboard. The aircraft began to move at 7:31 a.m. Eleanor Voss closed her laptop, not quickly, not dramatically. The slow, deliberate motion of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and has recognized it arriving. She was 67 years old. Silver hair cut close to her head. Navy jacket pressed smooth. The small silver pin at her lapel that no one on this aircraft had looked at twice. Eleanor was aware of all of this. She had counted on all of this. She stood Mr. Hayes, she said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who had spent 2 decades speaking in rooms where every word was being recorded and weighed, and would potentially be cited in documents that outlasted the moment of their delivery. Walter turned to look at her. She reached up and unclipped the pin from her lapel, held it in her open palm. This, she said, addressing the cabin rather than Walter alone, is a Sonix Pro Micro recording device. It has been active since the moment Mr. Hayes first showed his boarding pass, and was told that economy class was toward the rear of the aircraft. The silence in the cabin changed quality. It had been thus silence of people holding their breath. Now it became the silence of people who have understood that the room they are sitting in is larger than they thought, and that the walls extend further in every direction than they'd been able to see. I am Eleanor Voss, she said. I served as United States federal judge in the Northern District of Georgia for 22 years, the last 4 as chief judge. I retired 8 months ago. She looked at Officer James Okafor. Officer, I want to be clear for your report that this recording was made under circumstances that comply fully with Georgia's one-party consent statute and federal rule of evidence. Every word captured is fully admissible in any proceeding. James Okafor's pen continued moving across his notepad. Deanna Webb, beside him, was still writing. She had not stopped since entering the cabin. She would not stop until her report was complete. Eleanor turned back to Walter. The recording will be submitted to the Department of Transportation and the FAA within 48 hours, she said, regardless of what you decide to do with your own case, regardless of any private resolution. What, as I observed this morning, is not a matter between you and this crew alone. It is documented, systematic discriminatory conduct in a public transportation facility, and it will receive the federal attention it warrants. She paused. That said, she continued, her voice shifting from legal register to something more direct. One person speaking to another. I would like to explain why I didn't stand up an hour ago. The cabin waited. Walter said nothing. He was watching her with the full attention he'd given everything this morning, the quality of attention that made people feel they were being read accurately and without overlay. Because I wanted to see what you would do, Eleanor said. A man with every resource available to him, being treated as if he had none. I've watched people in crisis for 22 years. I've watched what people do when the room stops recognizing them. She held his gaze. You stood in that aisle for nearly 40 minutes. You held that boarding pass. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't perform. You didn't reach for your phone until you'd given everyone in this cabin the full opportunity to simply look at this piece of paper. Walter said nothing. That is worth documenting, Eleanor said. The rest of this was always going to end up documented, regardless of what I did. But that the way you stood here that needed a witness who understood what she was seeing. A long moment. You could have spoken sooner, Walter said. Yes. Why didn't you? Because a partial record in a case like this is a gift to the defense, Eleanor said. I needed every choice to have been made, every option exhausted. Where the record was complete, she met his eyes. Either way, Mr. Hayes, the record was going to reflect what happened in this cabin. The only variable was you. Walter was quiet, then simply, thank you. Eleanor nodded, sat back down, opened her laptop, and began typing the preliminary notes for a submission to federal regulators that she had in truth been composing in her mind since approximately 6:35 a.m. James Okafor closed his notepad, 11 pages, small, precise handwriting. He looked at Frank Dobbs. Mr. Dobbs, he said, I need you to come with me. Frank looked at the cabin, the passengers with their phones, the crew at various distances from the situation they'd created. Margaret Holloway standing near 3A like someone waiting for a sentence. Carol Brennan in the galley doorway. He looked at Walter Hayes, who was looking out the window and not at him. Frank bent down and picked up the clipboard, held it, set it on the nearest seat. I told myself, Frank said, that I was protecting the experience. Nobody had asked him to speak. The Cabots received his words with the attention of people who had learned over the last 90 minutes to let things arrive without managing them. The premium cabin experience. That's what I said to myself. Every time. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular. I told myself I was reading the situation correctly, that I was doing the job. He stopped, tried again. I think I was protecting something about myself, he said. Some idea about how things were ordered and who fit where. Some idea I didn't want to examine a pause. I didn't call it that. I never called it that. But I think that's what it was. 14 years, he said. To no one. Then he walked to the cabin door. James Okafor walked with him. Deanna Webb followed, closing her notepad as she went. Her report was complete. It contained 11 pages of her own notes alongside James's, taken from a different angle, capturing things James been positioned to miss, and James had captured things she'd missed. Together, the two documents constituted the most thorough first-hand record of the incident outside of Eleanor Voss's recording. At the threshold of the jet bridge, Frank stopped, his back to the cabin, his hand on the door frame. I don't know, he said quietly, if that explanation means anything. From the jump seat, Walter spoke. It means something, Walter said. It doesn't change the consequences. But it means something. Frank nodded, walked out. The jet bridge door closed. The cabin didn't applaud, didn't speak, didn't do anything that could be described as a collective action. What happened was more specific than that. The woman in 12B put her unused tissue down on the tray table and looked at nothing for a moment, her expression the expression of someone sorting through something private. The man in 7D turned to the passenger beside him, a stranger. They hadn't spoken once in the hour they'd been seated together, and made brief eye contact and looked away again. The older couple in 15A and 15B finally unclasped their hands, not because the moment had passed, but because they'd held on through it and could let go now. The cabin was processing. 200 people who had come onto an aircraft at 6:14 in the morning, expecting a 2-hour flight to New York, were now sit inside something they hadn't expected and would be thinking about for considerably longer than 2 hours. Kevin Merritt was still near the front of first class. Walter looked at him. Kevin looked up. "You made a calculation this morning," Walter said. "You looked at who was standing where and decided what the situation was and aligned yourself with what you thought was authority. That's a human instinct. It's also a dangerous one when the authority is wrong." He held the young man's gaze. "The next 12 months are going to require real work. Not punitive work, the kind of work that requires you to sit with what you did today and understand it and decide what kind of a person you're going to be afterward." Kevin swallowed. "Yes, sir," he said. "That's all," Walter said. "Not warmth, not cruelty. The clear delivery of something true from someone who had decided that honesty without theater was the most respectful thing he could offer a 27-year-old in this particular moment." Captain Rodriguez came out of the cockpit. He stood at the cockpit door and looked at Walter with the expression of a man who had been in the flight deck listening to everything and had decided that protocol was the wrong call this morning. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I want to apologize personally, and as the commanding officer of this aircraft for your experience this morning. I should have come out sooner," Rodriguez added. He said it without elaboration. A man who had assessed his own performance and found it wanting. "Yes," Walter agreed. "You should have." Rodriguez absorbed this without deflecting. "What do you need from me now?" "Keep the aircraft at the gate until I've finished. Then take us to New York." Rodriguez nodded, went back to the cockpit. First class cabin. Walter speaks. Captain Rodriguez came out of the cockpit. He was 53 years old. Compact frame, steady face. The particular quality of stillness that develops in people who spend their working lives responsible for 300 lives at altitude and have learned to measure everything, every word, every motion, every decision against that responsibility. Captains did not emerge from the flight deck during passenger situations. That was the protocol. The crew handled passenger situations. The captain flew the aircraft and trusted the people trained to manage human complications to manage them. Rodriguez had been in the cockpit for the entire exchange. He'd heard it through the intercom. Every word. He came out now, stood at the cockpit door. "Look, Walter, Mr. Hayes," he said, "I want to apologize, personally and as the commanding officer of this aircraft. What you experienced this morning is not what we are supposed to be." Walter looked at him. "I should have come out sooner," Rodriguez said. He said it simply, without elaboration. A man who had assessed a situation and found his own performance wanting and was naming that finding without excuse. "Yes," Walter agreed. "You should have." Rodriguez absorbed this. "What do you need from me now?" "Keep the aircraft at the gate until I've finished. Then take us to New York." "The way you always do," Rodriguez nodded. Went back to the cockpit. The door closed. Walter stood in the aisle. He looked around the cabin. The full cabin, all 12 of those visible from where he stood, 200 people in various states of attention, phones still raised or lowered, depending on whether they'd decided the moment required documentation or simply presence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The cabin had been arranged toward him for the last hour, all its attention organized in his direction. He spoke. The words landed without effort. "I want to speak to everyone on this flight," he said, "not as an executive. Just as a person who's been testing in this aisle for a long time and has some things to say that I should probably have said sooner in other rooms to other people." The cabin waited. "My father was a minister," Walter said, "Reverend Thomas Hayes. He never owned a car, not because he lacked the means eventually, but because when he was building his life, certain transactions simply did not complete. Nobody stated a reason. They were just suddenly unavailable, suddenly occupied with something else. The smooth, quiet machinery of a decision that had been made before he walked through the door. He paused, rode the bus every day. For 30 years, with his back straight and his chin level, as if he were entering somewhere he'd been specifically invited. He didn't perform dignity, he inhabited it. And he told me once I was 7 years old, I'd come home from somewhere that had made me feel like I didn't fit. He told me that the moment you let someone else decide how much space you deserve in a room, you've given them something they didn't earn, and you'll spend years trying to recover it. That the woman in 12B was no longer crying. She was writing something in her phone with the focused attention of someone recording something before it fades. The man in 7D had not reopened his laptop. He was looking at the empty seat beside him with an expression that suggested he's thinking about someone who wasn't there. I built Skybridge because I wanted to build something my father could have walked into without having to straighten his back first, Walter said. Without having to calculate before he arrived whether this would be a transaction that completed or one that quietly didn't. He looked around the cabin. I found out this morning that I built something that failed him anyway. Not because I intended that, but because I trust systems I hadn't examined closely enough, and because I assumed that the absence of formal complaints meant the absence of the problem, and because somewhere in 29 years of building, I stopped looking at the gaps between what the policy said and what the culture did. He let that sit. That is my failure, he said. Not Frank Dobbs's failure, not Kevin Merritt's failure, not the failure of anyone else on this aircraft. My failure. I built the conditions. I failed to maintain the oversight. And 7 people that we know of filed complaints that went into a system I trusted and never came out the other side. He looked out the window briefly. Atlanta. Still there. Still running. I can't give those 7 people back the flights they had. I can't undo what happened in this cabin this morning. What I can do, what I am going to do, starting today, not next quarter, not after the next board cycle, is build something different. Something that doesn't depend on the goodness of individuals to function correctly. Because individuals fail. I failed. The question is whether the system catches it when they do. He turned back to the cabin. Every person on this aircraft deserved to board, fly, and land without some making a judgment about them based on what they're wearing or what they look like. That is not a premium standard. It is the only standard. And this airline is going to meet it. He sat down, not in 1A. He sat in the jump seat near the galley. Because the point he needed to make wasn't about the seat. It was about what the seat had come to represent, and what it was going to mean from this point forward. That could wait. The cabin didn't applaud. He hadn't invited it. Some moments are not applause moments. Some moments are for receiving, not responding. The cabin seemed to understand this instinctively, the particular collective intelligence of a group of people who have been present for something real, and know that the appropriate response is to let it be real without immediately translating it into something more comfortable. First-class cabin. The protocol. Walter opened his laptop. He'd had it in the overhead with his briefcase since boarding. He retrieved it now, sat back down in the jump seat, and began to type the Skybridge Dignity Protocol. He'd thought about pieces of it before in the margins of compliance reports, in the gaps between shareholder calls, in the way ideas accumulate when you're paying attention to the right things but haven't yet organized what you're paying attention to into something with a structure. The specific events of this morning had be the structure, its shape, had made clear what was required versus what was merely preferable, had drawn the line between a policy that sounded good and a policy that actually changed something. He typed without stopping. Bay cameras for all customer-facing crew, mandatory in any interaction involving a seating dispute, a complaint, or a request for documentation. Footage reviewed weekly by a team with no operational connection to the regional office that generated it. No exceptions. No discretion at the supervisor level to waive the requirement. Every discrimination complaint, everyone, regardless of how it was characterized at intake, to be escalated automatically to an independent review board within 24 hours of filing. Not reviewed by the regional director. Not flagged for possible follow-up. Automatically escalated by system design to people with no stake in its outcome and every obligation to examine it. A passenger advocate position at every major hub. Independent, reporting direct to the CEO's office. No intermediate layer, no opportunity for institutional pressure to shape what got reported upward. The passenger advocate's job, to be present in the system in the way that Carol Brennan had been present behind the curtain, except with the authority to act on what they saw without calculating the professional cost. Anonymous reporting by three-digit text code, printed on every seatback card on every Skybridge flight. Guaranteed written response within 24 hours. The guarantee enforceable as a contractual obligation, not merely a policy aspiration. $28 million over a year. Not a round number chosen for a press release. A specific figure calculated from headcount, required training hours, audit costs, the projected expense of building the review board infrastructure, and a reasonable estimate of what independent auditing would require if done properly. Walter had done the math on the flight down last night. He'd had a feeling he would need it. He looked at the numbers. A dead, one more line, annual third-party civil rights audit, published publicly, not summarized. The full report, every finding, every recommendation, every metric the auditors chose to measure, whether or not those metrics were favorable, because an accountability system that only reported the things it wanted people to see wasn't an accountability system. It was a press release. He finished the document, sent it to Sandra with a single instruction. Distribute to legal and HR for immediate implementation review. Timeline for full rollout, 90 days. I want interim measures in place within 2 weeks. Then he opened the new document and began typing the company-wide email. He wrote it himself. He'd considered for approximately 30 seconds whether to route it through communications first. Let them sand the edges. Find the language that acknowledged the problem without overexposing the company. The careful corporate vocabulary that transformed a morning like this one into a learning opportunity and a commitment to continuous improvement. He closed that consideration. The email had to be his words or it was nothing. He typed to all Skybridge Airways employees from Walter D. Hayes, founder and CEO subject. This is what happened this morning, and this is what we're going to do about it. I am writing to you from the jump seat of Flight 609, which is still at the gate in Atlanta, delayed because of something that happened in this cabin approximately 90 minutes ago. I was discriminated against on this flight by members of our own crew. I was told to find my correct seat in economy class while standing in the seat I'd booked, which was 1A. I was told this by 4 people, none of whom looked at my boarding pass before forming their conclusion. The conclusion was formed in approximately 3 seconds, based on how I was dressed and what I look like. I want to be specific about that, because specificity is what this situation requires, not euphemism. Not the language of policy review. The specific truth. 4 members of crew decided, before examining a single piece of evidence, that I did not belong in first class. They made that decision because of my appearance. That is what happened. I also want to be specific about something else. This did not begin today. 3 formal complaints about discriminatory treatment in first-class cabins, Southeast routes, were filed through our system in the past 18 months. All 3 were closed before investigation by a regional director using a protocol provision that was designed for legitimate administrative purposes and was applied here in a way that buried exactly the kind of problem it should have surfaced. That regional director is currently under formal HR investigation. Beyond those 3 complaints, our informal feedback system shows a pattern that goes back approximately 4 years. Passengers on Southeast routes, in first-class cabins, reporting that they felt unwelcome. The pattern is clear in the data. It was not clear to me because I was not looking at the right data, and because I trusted that the systems I'd built were catching what they needed to catch. They were not. That is my failure. I built the conditions. I am responsible for what grew in them, and I am responsible for what changes now. Effective immediately, Skybridge Airways is implementing the following. He laid out the dignity protocol, each item, the body cameras, the independent review board, the passenger advocate positions, the anonymous reporting system, the $28 million investment and what it would fund, the annual third-party audit published in full. Then he wrote the final paragraph. I started Skybridge in 1994 because I wanted to build something that worked differently. Something my father, a man who rode the bus for 30 years, because nobody would complete certain transactions with him, could have walked into and been treated as what he was. A person who deserved to be here. I found out this morning that I haven't built that yet. I am going to build it now. Not as a response to today's incident, as a recognition that today's incident is evidence of something I should have found sooner, and that finding it, however it happened, means I now have the responsibility to fix it completely. This is what that fixing looks like. It starts today. Walter D. Hayes, founder and CEO, Skybridge Airways, he sent it 7:51 a.m. 41,000 employees would open it in the next 4 hours. Many of them would read it twice. Some of them would forward it to people outside the company. Some of those people would share it further. By the time Flight 6009 landed in New York, the email would be in 6 journalists' inboxes, quoted on 3 aviation industry forums, and discussed in a group chat among the members of a congressional subcommittee that had been considering legislation on discrimination in public transportation for the better part of 2 years. Walter didn't know any of that yet. He closed the laptop, looked out the window at the tarmac, then picked up his phone and called his son. Danny Hayes answered on the first ring. He was in the library, same as he'd been for the last hour and 40 minutes, the split screen still open on his laptop, though the live streams had ended when the aircraft began its pre-departure procedures. Dad, his voice was steadier now than it had been on the last call. The law school voice had returned, mostly. "You ready?" "Almost," Walter said. He was standing at the window of the aircraft, looking out at the gate area. The ground crew was beginning the pre-departure walk-around. 2 cargo handlers were moving equipment away from the hold. The machinery of departure, patient and indifferent, doing what it always did. "I watched the whole thing," Danny said. "Start to finish, I know. What Carol Brennan did." A pause. "That took something real, yes," Walter said. "It did. And Eleanor Voss." Danny was quiet for a moment. "You knew she was there?" "No, I had no idea. Did that change anything?" Walter thought about this. "It confirmed something," he said. "That what happened this morning was going to matter regardless of what I decided to do about it." Eleanor made sure of that. He paused. "I'm grateful for it. I love you, Dad," Danny said. "I love you, Danny." He ended the call, sat in 1A, looked at the gate area one more time, then out at the larger view, the tarmac, the other aircraft at adjacent gates, the distant horizon. Atlanta's skylines sat low and patient in the March morning. The aircraft pushed back from gate B12 at 7:31 a.m. 12 minutes late, which was, all things considered, the smallest possible consequence for everything that had happened between 6:19 and 7:31, 6 months later, Atlanta. Skybridge headquarters, 3rd floor, the new training facility with natural light and movable chairs and a wall that read, in large, clean letters, "Every passenger deserves to arrive." Walter stood in the corridor outside the glass wall, inside. Margaret Holloway, standing at the front of the room with 40 flight attendants in a semicircle before her. No slides, no communications-approved script. She was dressed the way she always dressed because she was still herself, and the point had never been to dismantle who she was, but to understand what she'd been using it for. She was standing differently than she had in that first-class cabin. The armor was still present. It was no longer the argument she was making. She was telling a story. Walter couldn't hear the words through the glass. He knew their shape. He'd read the curriculum she'd built across 3 drafts, each one more precise, each revision drilling deeper into the specific seeks of thoughts that had moved through her on that aircraft. Not what she'd done. How it had felt like not doing anything. How the judgment had arrived with the texture of perception rather than decision. How a person who had written the memos and run the workshops could still stand in a first-class cabin at 6:21 in the morning and fail every lesson she'd taught. The 40 flight attendants were watching her with the attention of people who recognized something, not in Margaret. In themselves, that was the point. Carol Brennan's office was on the 4th floor. Her first office with a window in 29 years, the Passenger Advocate Program had been running for 4 months. 14 hubs. 14 advocates, selected through a process Carol had designed with input from civil rights organizations, passenger feedback analysts, and 3 focus groups of frequent flyers, the last of which Walter had attended in person, sitting in the 3rd row unintroduced. Listening, the first independent audit had come back 6 weeks ago. Bias incidents on Skybridge flights, southeast routes, down 76% in the measurement period, not 80, not 90. 76, because that was what the independent auditors found when they looked without being told what to find. A number that meant something was working and something still wasn't, and the work had a direction and a distance still to go. Elliot Marsh's HR investigation had concluded in August. The findings documented a 4-year pattern of complaint reclassification, affecting not 3 cases but 11. The 3 formal complaints were the ones with paper trails clean enough to survive initial scrutiny. The others had been routed through informal channels and effectively neutralized before reaching the formal system. Marsh had signed before the findings were formalized. The full audit of his complaint management record was submitted to the Department of Transportation in September. The DOT investigation, based in part on Eleanor Voss's recording and her formal testimony, had opened in April and remained active. An interim report issued in July cited Skybridge's voluntary implementation of the Dignity Protocol and its cooperation with federal investigators as mitigating factors in determining the company's institutional liability. The final determination was expected in the spring. 7 airlines had contacted Sandra about the Dignity Protocol. 3 had begun implementation. 4 were in internal discussions that would either become implementation or would remain discussions, depending on what their leaderships chose to prioritize. Eleanor Voss sent Walter a note when her advisory panel appointment was announced. Retirement didn't take. Apparently, I needed something to argue about. You handled that morning with a quality of composure I've seen in fewer than a dozen people in 22 years on the bench. Don't waste it. Evie Walter kept the note in his desk drawer, next to a photograph of Eleanor Hayes, a small folded square of paper that was the boarding pass from Flight 609. He kept the boarding pass, not as a trophy, not as a wound, as a reminder of a specific thing, the feeling of holding evidence of your own existence while someone looked through it. The specific texture of that experience, how easy it would be to let it fade if he stopped making himself remember. Kevin Merritt called his mother the night of the flight. She was 63 years old, and she had raised Kevin alone since he was 9, and she listened to the entire account without interrupting once. She asked him one question when he finished. "What did you learn?" He was quiet for a moment. "That I thought I was reading the room," he said. "But I was following the weight of it. I mistook momentum for judgment. Those are the same thing more often than people admit," she said. "What are you going to do about it?" "The work," he said. "I'm going to do the work." He was doing the work. 8 months of probation completed, monthly certifications maintained, the bi-weekly counseling sessions, which he'd expected to be administrative and had found, to his surprise, to be the most useful professional conversations of his life. He sent Walter a letter in month 7. 2 sentences. "I was ashamed of what I did. I am grateful you left room for me to be a different person." Walter wrote back one sentence. "That room belongs to you. What you build in it is entirely yours." April. 7 months after the flight, Gate B12. Again, Walter and Danny, side by side with coffee and carry-ons, and the particular ease of 2 people who had stopped filling silence because they'd long since run out of things they needed to say and had started choosing the things they wanted to. Danny was finishing school in 6 weeks. He had 2 offers, one from firm, the kind of position that sent a specific signal about trajectory. One from the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights entry level, less money, longer hours, work that would not appear on a salary statement in any meaningful way for years. He'd taken the second one. Walter hadn't told him what to do. He'd listened to Danny describe both options across a dinner table for 40 minutes, and at the end said, "So it sounds like you already know," and Danny had said, "Yeah, I think I do." At the gate, Danny looked at his father, at the gray coat, folded over Walter's arm. "You always have it," Danny said. "Yes, even when we're in the suit, especially then." Danny looked at it for a moment. What does it feel like to carry it? Walter thought about the question the way he thought about questions that deserved actual answers. Like knowing, he said. Not in the general sense, the specific kind. Knowing where I came from and what that required. And knowing that none of what came after the company, the title, the suits changed what the coat was for. It just changed what I had to remember to keep remembering. Danny was quiet. Then, what would Grandpa Thompson say about all of it? The flight, the protocol, everything. Walter looked at the departure board. Flight 609 to New York. Gate B12. Boarding in 8 minutes. He thought about a man who rode a bus for 30 years, who had raised a son not by teaching certain things as lessons, but by demonstrating them as a life, who had understood thoughts at some point early enough that it became simply the way he moved through the world, that the only dignity that mattered was the kind you carried yourself. He'd say, "I built something worth examining," Walter said, "and then I examined it. And that those two things together are what he raised me to be capable of." He paused. He'd also say, "I took too long to look." Danny smiled, small. "Real, he'd be right," Danny said. He usually was. The gate agent announced boarding. They stood, picked up their bags, or walked through the jet bridge, turned left, sat down in seat 1A. He placed the gray coat in the overhead himself, carefully. Then sat and looked out the window at Atlanta in the April morning, the light coming at the angle it comes in spring, lower and longer than March, slightly gold in a way that carried a different kind of warmth. The new flight attendant, Maria, second year, a dignity protocol training certification on her lanyard, came to the front of the cabin. She did not ask him to verify his seat, did not ask if he was sure he belonged here, did not make the calculations that Frank Dobbs had made, and then made again and made once more until a morning had been built entirely on its foundation. She said, "Good morning. Can I get you anything before we push back?" Walter looked up at her. "Coffee," he said. "Black." Coming right up. She moved away. Danny was in 1B, already working. The early morning focus of someone who had found the thing he was meant to do and was doing it. Walter looked out the window. He thought about the boarding pass in his desk drawer. About the 3 complaints 11, actually. Once Marsh's full record was audited that had gone into a system and not come out. About Carol Brennan standing in a galley for 23 minutes holding the truth and then walking out with it anyway. About Margaret Holloway in a room on the 3rd floor, standing in front of 40 people with the specific courage of someone telling a story that costs something every time they told it. He thought about 76% and what remained in the other 24. He thought about his father, not the lesson, not the words, just the man. The specific quality of how Thomas Hayes had moved through a world that tried to tell him he was smaller than he was, not with anger, not with performance, but with the settled certainty of someone who had decided, early and permanently, that he was not going to organize himself around other people's failures. Walter had built 30 years on that inheritance. He was going to spend however many years remained making sure it was worth inheriting. The aircraft pushed back. Atlanta fell away, and the sky at altitude was the same in every direction, which meant the destination was a choice, which had always been the point.